I want to do something else. We're getting a little bit of a late start for the sermon this morning. How many would object if I go 5 minutes over? Okay, overruled. Let's be standing this morning, and take out your Bibles, and we're going to look at James, the 4th chapter, as I've been going through the book of James when I preach on Sunday mornings. And we're down to chapter 4 and verses 13 through 17. We're going to look at those 4 or 5 verses, verses 13 through 17. Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast and brag, and all such boasting is evil. Anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it, sins. You may be seated. When I was looking at this passage this last week, I was beginning to think about what I need to title this. And there's a lot of ideas that really jump out, a lot of things that come from the passage this morning. But there's a number of ideas. One of the things would be symptoms of too much control. And control in our lives. In other words, us taking control of our lives. And some of that begins to be seen as we take that approach to life. And then there's also just the simple idea of self-sufficiency. And feeling good about me, and I can take care of me, and I'm just totally self-sufficient. And then the one that I settled on today is this one, too much me. So we're going to call it Too Much Me today. No one likes to be around for too long, someone who's all about him or herself. And our text gives the symptoms of too much me. Sometimes I smile when I think about the 2-year-old that is in your home, and I look back to the days when we had 2-year-olds growing up in our home, and you want to take the spoon from them and help them feed themselves, and what do sometimes? They want to do it themselves, and they want to have control, and you know what, when you're 2, that's a good thing, because they are, well, sometimes that's a good thing, because they are growing and developing, and that's going on, and sometimes that's a good thing. Or when your 2-year-old struggling to learn a task and you just try to do it for him, of course that's a good thing. But sometimes we never grow out of our need to be the center of our world and the center of other people's world. We want to be the center of attention sometimes, and sometimes that whole outlook on life takes its place in our relationship with God. Too much me. One of our social workers that I work with, I tease her all the time. She comes into the office, and she wants me to tell her what it's all about. And she said, now it's all about me. And she'll be talking about something, and I'll look at her and I say, no, it's all about me. And we get into that kind of a discussion sometimes, not day after day, thank goodness. But she has that thing going on where it's all about her. One time I was talking with a preacher friend of mine, and he began talking about his life and how things were unfolding. And he said, I'm a little bit ahead of schedule. Well, he didn't say it quite that way, but he said, and he felt good about his first full-time ministry. And things were starting to go pretty well. And he said, I'm trustee. He was a trustee of a local Bible college and involved in 2 or 3 other things that were going on in the community. And he was feeling good about the fact he was getting to where he wanted to be. I had to shake my head, and I wondered, do we have a little bit too much me here? And what is going on in his spiritual life? Too much me, perhaps. Well, I think this text this morning gives all the signs of too much me. Where do you and me enter into this text? Well, there's too much me when you find yourself planning without God. When you find yourself planning without God. Look at verse 13, for instance. Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. That sounds like plans to me, doesn't it to you? And he's making plans about going to some place and going to do all this stuff that makes up life. Now don't misunderstand, the Bible is really filled with passages that direct us to plan. One of those places is in Romans the 12th chapter and verse 11. In Romans the 12th chapter and verse 11, he says, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Now when we think about what is said there in verse 11, some of that, doesn't it, requires a little bit of planning if we're going to have zeal and if we're going to serve the Lord and be involved in some of this stuff. It's going to take some planning. James 4, though, is not about planning before we act. And, of course, the book of Proverbs says a whole lot about the necessity of making plans and doing some things in order and some of the wisdom that goes with that in life in the book of Proverbs. James, though, is not talking about planning before we act. It is about planning without God in it. That's what it's about. Here in James chapter 4, he's talking about, for instance, buying a home. Going to this or that city. I think buying a home probably has something to do with that. Is God in the center of our thinking processes when we think about buying a home? How long we're going to stay? What we'll do for a living? Is God in that? Our personal financial goals, is God in that? And does God come first as we make our personal financial goals in life? That comes, I think, from this text here in James chapter 4. But where, as we look at verse 13, is there any mention at all about God being in any of that? Verse 13 focuses on men who feel their future, and the future of all of the men lie in their own ability. Well, it's what I can do. Our own plans, our own energy, if I can do it. Our own effort. If I work hard enough, I'm going to do it. Our own works, discipline. You have to get up in the morning and sometimes stay up late at night to get done what we want to do. And our confidence and image and technology, maybe they're going to find just the thing to allow me to get rich or do what it is that I want to do. Science, industry, education. If I have enough education, then I can get to where I want to be. Training, production, economy, and employment. Most of this is important in life. Don't get me wrong. Don't hear me wrong. Most of this is important in life. But where is God in it as we make our plans? That's the issue. That's the problem with a person with too much me. We think in terms of all of this and leave God out of our plans. Because, have you thought? Will you actually ever reach the place you want to go to? Will there be an accident along the way? Maybe the unexpected will come up. Will the economy hold? And will others that you depend on to support your business come through when that time comes? There's a lot of unknowns, isn't there? Was not planning without God the problem with the Jews in the Old Testament? There's a passage in Ezekiel, the 28th chapter, that I want you to listen to. In Ezekiel, the 28th chapter, in verses 4 and 5. Here he says, by your wisdom and understanding, you have gained wealth for yourself and amassed gold and silver in your treasuries. By your great skill in trading, you have increased your wealth, and because of your wealth, your heart has grown proud. A prophecy there against them in Ezekiel, the 28th chapter, and that covered a whole lot of nations and people groups back there in the Old Testament because of them and what they could do, and God was not in it. He was left out. There's also Proverbs, the 27th chapter and verse 1. Proverbs, the 27th chapter and verse 1. I want to turn and read that one too. Proverbs 27 and verse 1 says, do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring forth. That is so true. Is God in it? You need to recognize there's more to life than me. And what is more important than me is trusting in God to walk with us and to help us through and to see us through the challenges and the activities of life. Well, there's too much me when you plan without God. There's also too much me when you fail to recognize the uncertainty of life. The uncertainty of life. Go back to James 4 and verse 14. Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You're a mist that appears for a little while, and then it vanishes. Life really is uncertain, isn't it? Life is so uncertain. Think about your life. What happened last year in your life that you would have never expected a year ago, but it happened? I tell my patients all the time in my work with community hospice, you know what? I could go before you. You know that's true, don't you? I could go before you, so I'll tell you what. Let's make the most of today. And let's live today while we are alive. That's true. This year I'm planning a trip to see my eldest the first week of June. In late July I'm going to be, get this again, going to be judging sheep again in Eugene, Oregon. It's a long trip, but who knows? Anything can really happen because life is uncertain. We cannot know the future. An accident? Some disease, a broken relationship, some bad news, some good news. Death, a plane crash, money lost, a serious fire, a stock market rise or fall, some stock collapse. We do not know. The old song, I don't know about tomorrow. I just live from day to day. But you know what? I know the one who knows about tomorrow, so I trust Him. And that's the song for this age. That's the song for your life and for mine. Our lives really are, at most, a vapor that appears for a brief time and then vanishes away. It may come today or tomorrow, but it is coming. Maybe it'll be a faulty bolt or a tire that blows on your travels. Someone falling asleep with the controls, an accident, a disease, a thief, a heart attack, a fire, a drowning, or simply old age. But life is uncertain. Wise people recognize the uncertainty of life and our need for God to guide us through it all. Our need for God. Notice the verses. Back in James chapter 1 and verse 10, he says, but the one who is rich should take note should take pride in his low position, because he will pass away like the wild flower. There's also that passage in Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 27. There, as the writer to Hebrews is writing, he says, just as a man is destined to die once, and after that to face judgment. He talks in Hebrews 9:27. In 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 24, Peter has this to say, for all men are like grass, all their glory like the flowers of the field. The grass withers and the flowers fall, but what? The word of the Lord stands forever. It stands forever. Life is uncertain. Nothing is ever certain, but God and His Word are certain.
Amen.
And that is what we trust as we go through life.
Amen.
There's also too much me. When you fail, of course, to acknowledge God. We've been talking about that one, but here it's clear in our text. In verse 15. In verse 15, instead you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. Acknowledge God if it's His will. Because after all, God is the one who's in charge, right? Too much me is seen when we do not acknowledge God in our lives. I like Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 6. I'm going to turn back there for this one. Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 6 says, in all your ways, acknowledge Him, God, and He will make your paths straight. In all your ways, acknowledge Him. Proverbs 3:6. Paul had it right in Acts the 18th chapter and verse 21 when he was there with the church in Ephesus. In the 18th chapter and verse 21 of Acts, he says, but as he left, he promised, I will come back if it is God's will. Then he set sail from Ephesus. I'll come back if it is God's will. Later on, in Acts the 20th chapter, you remember, as he was going back to Jerusalem, he stopped and he met with the elders of the Ephesian church, and there down by the seashore, he meets with them and he talks with them. He gives them some parting words and instructions, and then they embrace each other and they pray and they have a tearful departure as Paul then heads back to the east side of the Mediterranean. If it's God's will. Well, that time it was. Do you remember what Jesus prayed in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 10? He said, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. He said, thy kingdom come. Do you remember the next part?
Thy will be done.
Thy will be done. Living our lives in an acknowledgement of God's will. And the fact that we fall under God's authority and we submit ourselves to whatever His will is, because God knows what's best. I like Matthew chapter 12. I have to turn there too. Matthew chapter 12 and verse 50. Matthew chapter 12 and verse 50 says it this way. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. Whoever what? Submits themselves to God's will and does God's will in obedience is his brother, sister, and mother. I don't know about you. I want to be Jesus' brother. Don't you?
Amen.
And his sister. or his mother. You and I need James 4:15. Instead, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will. There's another one here. There's too much me when there's boasting, bragging, and arrogance. In verse 16, do you see it? As it is, you boast and brag, and all such boasting is evil. And what was their boasting? Their boasting and bragging was about what they were going to do, without mentioning God in their plans. There's too much me when there's boasting, bragging, and arrogance. You remember, some of you don't, well, a lot of you do, but do you remember Cassius Clay? You know what? He later changed his name to Muhammad Ali. He is one of, I'm sorry to say this, Joe and Eleanor.
I know, he was from Kentucky.
He was one of Louisville's, wasn't it? He was one of Louisville's, you have to say that like you got marbles in your mouth, I learned. He was one of Louisville's claims to fame, Muhammad Ali. And he was a great boxer. Now, the problem with him was he always would say on the news when they'd interview him what he was going to do, how he was going to do it, sometimes when he was going to do it. The problem is he was most of the time right. Because he was a boxer who was gifted in that way, and he changed the sport ever after because of his talent and his ability. But humility was not his strong suit. He was just the opposite. God does not appreciate braggers or arrogant people, may I say. Does he? He doesn't. Well, Jesus, in fact, told a parable about this problem. I want you to look at the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12, and verses 16 through 21. Luke chapter 12 and verses 16 through 21. He told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He had good land. He thought to himself, what'll I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns, build bigger ones. There I'll store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool. This very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anybody who stores up for himself things for himself, but is not rich toward God. He said what? He said, what shall I do? He said, I will. Later in verse 18, I will. My grain, my goods. Verse 19, I'll say to myself, you take life easy. And on. Everything was about who? Me. Everything was about me. But there was coming a day of reckoning. There always does. There is too much me when there is boasting and bragging and arrogance. Too much me. There's a final one real quickly. Then, too much me is sin. That's verse 17. Anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it, sins. If you know the good you ought to do and don't do it, you sin. How do we know the good we ought to do? It's right here in this book, isn't it? That's how we know the good we ought to do. Well, and why wouldn't you do the good that you ought to do? Well, it's because I am thinking about me and my plans. That's why I wouldn't do the good I ought to do. Jesus spoke to that issue, you remember, in Matthew, the 7th chapter, when he culminated the Sermon on the Mount. And he got to the end of that sermon and he said, you know what? He told about the story of the two builders. One built his house upon a rock. One built his house on the sand. And of course, the wise man and the foolish man, the one who built his house on the rock was able to stand the test of time and the storms of life. The one who built his house on the sand did not. Well, he didn't have a house when the storms came. The floods came and all that, and they washed it all away. Because it was built on sand, on nothing stable. And Jesus' point was, if you take my words and do them and put them into practice, that's like building your house on the rock. Do that, is what he said. Jesus talked to this issue too. Anyone who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it sins. But he who knows the good he ought to do and does do it is righteous in God's sight. I again don't know what the best title is for this text, but it has a whole lot to do with me, doesn't it? Let's have a little less me and a little more of he. A little more of Jesus in our lives. A little more of Jesus in our lives. How about you? The question is always, does Jesus control your life? We talked this morning in Sunday school about Jesus Christ being formed in us, growing in us. Is he expanding in your life? And are you and I diminishing in our lives? It's about him. This morning, we're going to sing a song of invitation.